Book 3, Part 10. I didn't look forward to dealing with my dad. I missed him like crazy and wanted to see him badly, but I didn't envy us the task of convincing him. Track crawled up on the bed and lay next to me against the wall. He was smiling too, although it was a bit impish, and I looked at him hard. "So, you gonna name your first pup after me, right?" he whispered. Wow. I felt a wave of heat wash over me and thought, for a moment, that I did blush. Ryan gave a low growl and Track looked up. "What? I have to lay my claim now before one of those furry mounds over there tries to steal my glory." "Your glory?" Rock snapped back from somewhere behind the wall of bodies. She didn't say yes. Besides, Track is a stupid name for a pup. I moaned. Were they really having this conversation? "And Rock is any better?" Track laughed next to me. "That's enough," Ryan stated firmly, but I heard the happiness in his voice too. I was too embarrassed to look up at Phil at the moment, and mentally decided to find a way to get even with my best friend. I winced a bit and turned. May shook her head. "Sorry about that, dear. Had to reset the bone there." She rubbed my forearm. "That should be the worst of it." Beth wiped a few stray tears from her cheek and smiled at me. "I'm going to make you a nice cup of tea. It will help with the pain, you poor thing." I bit my lower lip, not sure how to tell her that I don't eat or drink in this form. Fortunately, or unfortunately, I didn't need to. Track blurted the information out, and I shot him a hard look. He was propped up on his elbow, still grinning ear to ear. "What?" he shrugged under my hard stare. "Oh, I forgot about that," Beth whispered, and I glared at Track before turning back to her. She smiled at me. "Well then, I'll just put together a salve that should help just as much." May nodded. "The topic one. I already have the splint in place." The dark-haired healer nodded and turned, bending over a set of bowls and bottles that were now lined up on the bedside table. "We don't have many vampire visits," May chuckled, and I smiled. "She's mostly wolf," Track put in happily. I whipped my head back to him, and he nodded. "At least she is now." He gave a wink and chuckled, and I couldn't help but giggle. He looked so happy right then. I missed seeing that smile, the one that sparkled in his eyes. My nose tingled, and he shook his head. "Don't you dare," he teased. "There's enough wet faces standing around here." May stood up. "Well, it's set and splinted," she nodded, then turned. "Now, due to the current circumstances, I will forgive the fact that my direct orders were ignored." I saw her look right at Phil, and he flinched. She shook her head. "But now that things are right, if any one of you upsets her..." Phil put up both of his hands. "We'll make sure she stays completely happy," he grinned. "I bet you will," Jackson chuckled, and Rock turned and landed a blow mid-chest. Jackson fell back a step, but chuckled as he rubbed the spot. I laughed softly. It felt good to see everyone happy again. Even Ryan's eyes were smiling when he reprimanded them. "Take it outside," he finished. The two turned and shoved each other out of the room. Something crashed shortly after. "Sorry about that," came Rock's voice, followed by another grunt. Then the front door opened and shut, and we heard them start to battle outside. Ryan sighed, but it didn't wipe the smile off his face. Beth actually giggled. It's good for them. They're happy. May nodded, though I couldn't see her as the giggly type. I moved a bit and then wiggled and used my good arm to push myself into a sitting position. Track sat up as well, but stayed on the bed with me. Well now, Beth beamed in a chipper voice, all there is to do is rest and enjoy. She even clapped her hands together for emphasis. Cal stepped in then, with Will behind him. Ryan turned and nodded, then walked in further. Cal smiled at me and came over to the bed. All fixed up now? I lifted my arm, showing him the splint that went from just below my elbow to my wrist. Yep. No cast? Nope, she might shift again, Track stated, and Cal nodded. I moaned. When you're up for it, the Owl Saw Click Alpha stated, there are some folks that would like to say hello. Not now, May stated, though she didn't snap. He nodded quickly. I know, but I just wanted to let Raina know that everyone is thinking about her. I cleared my throat and adjusted the blanket over my lap. She can crash through a double-paned window and scale a 20-foot fence, Track stated. But she has this thing about being in the spotlight. Makes her kinda edgy. That did it. I took my good arm and flung it. My left arm wasn't as good as my right, but I landed a good blow to his arm. He jumped, grabbed it, and then laughed. What? The healer said no stress, and we all know how you get around crowds. I went to swing again, but he caught my arm. Now, you can't think I'm going to sit here and let you get another one in. Cal laughed, and I turned back to him. He shook his head. No rush. Al was pacing outside waiting, but he knows better. My smile fell a little. Little Al? Don't go making her feel guilty, Will said, stepping up. No, I wasn't saying. I smiled. It's okay. He could come in. Cal frowned and I nodded. I'd like to see him. The owl saw Wolf turned and looked at his alpha, who shrugged. Then he turned and looked at mine. Ryan smiled and gave a small nod. Just for a few minutes. Cal grinned and left the room quickly. May sighed. There are already too many in this room. She looked around. This girl needs to rest. If you don't need to be here, scoot. She made a shooing gesture with her hands. When no one moved, she put them on her hips. Beth leaned forward. Protectors. The blonde healer's eyes opened. Ah, yes, I forgot about that. She looked around the room. Well, you can do your protecting from the front room. Marcus walked out, smiling at me over his shoulder. Will patted Phil on his back. That's my cue. I may be the alpha of every wolf and tree branch here, but when it comes to the sick or injured, he shrugged, grinning, and left the room as well. That left the healers, Phil, Ryan, and Track. Ryan moved up next to the bed. You have some healing to do, and then we have some talking and planning to do. His eyes still sparkled, and I nodded. He leaned over, kissed my forehead, and then shook a finger at me. No more running off. Okay, I whispered, and then he left the room as well. Beth leaned over, a bit of paste on the end of 2 fingers. I'm just going to rub this onto your forehead, she stated, and then pushed my hair back and started to do just that. It will help with the pain and keep you more comfortable. May leaned over. We'll be back to check on you shortly. Then the 2 healers left. Phil walked over and sat on the edge of the bed. Then we both looked at Track. He shrugged. What? I'm comfortable. Just then there was a knock on the open door and we all turned. Cal walked in, and so did little Al, with both of his hands behind his back. I smiled at him as he walked over, his cheeks red. Cal moved to let his little brother step up, and Phil moved his legs. Al walked over to the very edge of the bed and then pulled his hands out. One held a larger bouquet of wildflowers, the other a folded piece of paper. They're beautiful, I sighed, accepting the flowers and lifting them to my nose. They did smell good, fresh, slightly damp, and had a beautiful scent. I drew this for you, he stated, holding out the paper. Oh, I looked around since I couldn't take it with my other hand. Phil took the flowers and stood. I'll get something to put these in, he said, and left. I laid the paper on my lap and used my good hand to unfold it. My smile widened. It was a picture of a grass field, a large yellowish moon over it, outlined in black. The sky was colored blue and black to make it look like night, and there were yellow stars in the sky. White crayon doesn't show up good on white paper, he explained shyly, so I had to use yellow. It's amazing, I stated sincerely. Then I noticed some forms at the bottom, on the grass, colored part. There were shapes, colored brown, yellows, and mixtures of both. When I spotted the all-black one in the center, I smiled. They were wolves. They were us. He leaned over the bed and pointed to the forms. That one is Cal. That's me, and that's you, Al explained. I oohed and awed and let him point out all the wolves in the picture. Hey, what about me? Track asked, pretending to be hurt. Al sighed and pointed to another form. You're right there, sheesh. Track leaned over my lap. How come Rock is bigger than me? Because he is bigger than you, Al and I said at the same time, and then we both laughed. Track huffed and pretended to be insulted. Al shrugged and then looked at me. It's you. Here. Here? He nodded, and Al saw, all of you. Yes, we are. No, I mean like... Okay, Al, that's enough, Cal laughed, quickly scooping his blond brother up into his arms. You want May and Beth after you for keeping her up too long? Al wiggled in his brother's arms, and Cal finally flung him over one shoulder. I better get him fed. He gets a bit cranky when he hasn't eaten. He laughed when little fists pummeled his back. Then he turned and headed towards the door. Just let me know if you need anything, he stated, looking back. I nodded and waved at Al, who stopped the onslaught to wave back and then continued to use his brother's back as a drum. Put me down. I can walk, he huffed as they disappeared. Track and I laughed, and then Phil walked back in. My flowers were in a tall wooden cup now. He sat them on the bedside table and then sat down, looking at the picture on my lap. I handed it to him and pointed everyone out. First he brings you flower and now art. I wonder if I need to have a wolf-to-wolf talk with my youngest rival. I giggled and Track shrugged. You better watch out. He might run you over with his wagon. We all laughed then. Finally, Phil gave Track a look, and my friend sighed. All right, fine. He hopped up on all fours and leaned over me. Just remember what I said. He gave me a quick kiss on the cheek, just as I used my good arm to shove him hard. He landed across my legs, and I winced. Dang, he was heavy. He crawled off me, then smacked Phil on the back. You and I need to have a wolf-to-wolf talk later, too. Phil and I turned and looked at him. He shrugged. Hey, I'm her best friend. I have a right to sit Phil down and give him the death threat talk. I tilted my head, but Phil laughed. Yeah, okay. Once she goes to sleep, you can do that. Track winked at me and left, leaving the door cracked open a bit, which made me laugh again. Phil sighed, went over, shut it, and came back to the bed. My right arm was the closest, so I lifted it and held it out. He carefully took my hand and laid it back on the bed, still holding it. It was nice to feel this good and still have all my memories. Then a thought hit me, and I frowned. Hey now, what's with the mood swing? He said, smiling at me. I bit my lower lip. About what Trax said. About naming... He chuckled. Don't worry about that. There's no way we're naming a pup Track. My head lowered even more. It's not that, I sighed. I'm a hybrid, and... Phil reached over with his other hand and lifted my chin. We don't need to talk about that now. We have enough on our plates at the moment. Frowning, I gave a small nod. He sighed. Tay, I know that there's a possibility that there won't be any pups for us. A large rock landed in my stomach. Not all hybrids could get pregnant. My mother did, but that didn't mean I could. I love you. We have each other. When I didn't smile, he shrugged. If we really want to have one, I could talk to Sally about adopting Track. I looked up at him and he nodded. I'm sure she'd be more than happy to let us have him. I heard that, came a voice from the other side of the door. My eyes widened and Phil grinned. Although, we might look a bit odd at the father-son games, he said a bit louder. There were no such games, but it broke my mood and I laughed. You guys are mental, Track snarled from the front room. Track? Get away from the door, came Ryan's voice. Did you hear what he said? My best friend snapped. There was a low growl and then silence. I giggled and Phil smiled. See? Now no more sadness. I like seeing you smile. So, I guess we need to figure out the next step, I said quietly, looking down at our hands. Phil nodded. Yes, we do, but not right this minute. But everyone should be back home, Phil, I frowned. You've all been taken away from your families. My family is right down the road, he chuckled. My mom pitched a serious fit when they went to get the owl saw females and she couldn't come too. When my eyes widened, he nodded. So they're right here. Well, close enough to here. I shrugged. Well, they shouldn't be. Plus, what about the others? They should... That's all I got out. Phil leaned over and kissed me, cutting off the rest of my whining. It worked, too. His lips felt so good against mine. Without thinking about it, I wrapped both arms around his neck and pulled him to me, leaning back against the pile of pillows behind me. My broken arm was straight out, but I didn't care. His arm slid around me, and his kiss intensified. My heart raced and my head spun, my skin prickling from the sensation. When he finally pulled away a bit, I held on. He smiled at me, a little out of breath. I've been wanting to do that for a while. You did, in the kitchen, I teased, also out of breath. He shook his head. I meant with all the holes filled. We both grinned. and then I leaned forward and kissed him again. He moaned softly, and I responded the same. Several minutes later, he broke the kiss again, this time breathing even harder. He pulled one of his hands out from behind my back and pushed the hair out of my face. "You're supposed to be resting," he teased. "I am," I smiled back. His brown eyes twinkled and his dimples showed over his strong jaw. I took my hand and traced them both with my finger. He was gorgeous, smart, strong, and all mine. He adjusted himself a bit so that all of his weight wasn't crushing me. "I think I remember when I fell in love with you," he whispered, a hint of surprise in his voice. "In the cave?" "Nope," he chuckled. "It was that time you got stuck in that tree." My forehead wrinkled and he grinned. "I was so ticked at you for getting stuck." He sat up just a bit more, his arms on either side of me, so he was hovering over me. I leaned back into my pillows and tilted my head up a little. Ryan had to calm me down. He actually thought it was funny. Okay, I was a bit lost here. But I couldn't calm down, and I didn't understand why, he shrugged. "It's not like you were the first pup to get stuck up a tree." I rolled my eyes and he chuckled, but for some reason I was so mad. "At me?" "I thought so," he stated. "But now that I look back on it, I realize I wasn't mad at you. I was mad at the fact that you were up there, stuck. And if you fell..." "You mean you liked me way back then?" He sat up then, and so did I. I had no idea. Phil has always stayed away from the guys and me, for the most part. He didn't flat out avoid us, but he was our clique alpha and didn't horse around and play with us. I thought it was because he was our authority figure, and also a lot more mature than the rest of us. "Everyone was convinced that you and Track..." He shook his head. "Even I would have bet anyone that the two of you were going to hook up." I winced and he smiled. "I see now that what you two have is very different from what I thought. But back then, well, Track was my pack mate. You were too, but you were special." "Wow, that sounds more like a disease than a compliment," I teased. This was blowing my mind. I would never thought that Phil... I couldn't even finish that thought. So I pushed the nagging feelings aside and then shut them down completely. "Nice to know it was so easy," I huffed. "It wasn't at first, and every now and then it tried to get the best of me," he admitted. Wow, I was sitting there with my mouth open and my brows high on my forehead. He was still smiling, though. "When I would see you with the guys, and they would get too rough with you," he held up one hand when I pursed my lips. "Not that you couldn't handle them. I just got a twinge of jealousy and wanted to protect you." He shrugged. "At the time I just thought I needed to settle them down so that I didn't get another reprimand from Ryan about my clique causing trouble." "You got yelled at because of us?" Phil chuckled, more than once. Again I was speechless. Something else seemed to be happening a lot. As much as I loved him right now, which was with every part of me, I had not felt anything more than respect for him and awe at times. He was also so... together. Then I tilted my head as a thought crossed my mind. "I remember you sitting at a bonfire with... what's her name?" "What's her name?" he grinned. I rolled my eyes again, and he leaned down and kissed me softly on the lips. "You mean Teresa?" "Yeah, her." I said, with a growl that surprised me. And you were jealous? Another kiss. No, I whispered, losing my breath. At least I didn't think I was. Another kiss, just a little bit longer this time. But, he whispered. I was panting a bit now. But, I swallowed hard. I kept looking over at the two of you. His kisses were so soft. He smiled as he pulled back again. So you were jealous. Ugh, I grunted and pushed him back a bit. This was blowing my mind, and I needed to think it through. I remember her glaring at me. Then I chuckled. Then again, she glared at everyone. Phil nodded, and I bit my lower lip. I remember thinking that I wished she would leave you alone so you could have me? He was playing with me now, and I pushed at him harder. Unfortunately, he was strong and didn't budge. No, I snapped, but with a smile. So you could come and hang with us. You look so bored just sitting there with her. I was bored out of my mind, he confessed. But your group was so close. I had distanced myself and stayed away when you would come to visit. Phil sat up then. I didn't even realize why until just now. I guess I knew all that time, but I had pushed it back so far and so deep that I really had no idea. He seemed as surprised as I was. Well, good thing you finally figured it out, I teased. He wiggled his brows. Or good thing you are extremely hard-headed and snuck out of the manor that night. I laughed. Oh, so now my stupidity is a good thing. Instead of answering, he leaned over and kissed me again. Chapter 12. Chapter 12. Sometime later I woke up and smiled as Phil moved next to me. I carefully rolled onto my side and stared at him as he slept. His face was relaxed and content. I listened to his breathing and I inhaled his scent. My wolf, I thought, and then smiled as his eyes blinked open. He looked over at me and then pulled me into his arms. How long have you been awake? He asked quietly and then yawned. I snuggled up to his chest and shrugged. Only a minute or two. I was worried that this was all a dream, he confessed, and I nodded into his chest. I had had the same fear. I had an unsettling dream, he whispered, kissing the top of my head. It was one of the Polson bonfires. He cleared his throat to get the sleep out of his voice. I was sitting on a log with what's her name? I giggled and he chuckled. I was bored and she was rambling on about something, but I was too busy watching you and the crew. The crew? Mm-hmm. You were all sitting on the rugs, laughing, joking, horsing around like you usually do, and then Track jumped up and announced to everyone that you two were married. I cringed. I loved Track dearly. He was my best friend in the world, and most people got the wrong impression of us at first. But married to him? I shivered, and Phil chuckled again. Guess I might have to have that wolf-to-wolf talk with him after all. I laughed, and he hugged me closer. It's just a dream, and I know now there isn't anything like that between you two. He paused for a long time, and I looked up at him. The smile dipped a little, and he pushed the hair out of my face. I don't think it was really him in the dream. No? I mean, it was, but I don't think that's what the dream was about. Oh, I said softly, realizing what he meant. Jonathan. I bit my lower lip, and he gave me another soft squeeze. I guess we needed to have this talk. Phil, You don't have to explain. I think I do. Let's save it for another time then. I shouldn't have brought it up and ruined our few minutes of peace. Of peace? Just then the door flew open and we both turned. Track and Jackson walked in, and I moaned and turned, hiding my head in Phil's chest. Can I help you, boys? Phil stated calmly over the top of my head. Track was spitting nails that you might have. Jackson's voice cracked at the end, and I stiffened. He wouldn't dare. Phil kissed the top of my head and then pushed up on his elbow. Well, as you can see, we are both completely dressed and on top of the covers. Oh my God, was this really happening? I wanted to crawl under the bed right now. Jackson laughed. Ryan had to order him not to come in here. That made me flip over, wincing as my broken arm came with. You defied Ryan? Heck no, Jackson stated, now grinning. Ryan told him he was not allowed to come in until you woke up. Then he shrugged. And you're awake, so no defiance. Track rolled his eyes, but I saw him look at both of us hard. Yes, like Phil said, we were both fully clothed and on top of the covers. You my nursemaid now? I teased. Track nodded. Yep. Then he looked at Phil, who sat all the way up. I smiled at him. He looked so cute with his hair all over the place. Then I moaned and used my good hand and ran my fingers through mine quickly. Jackson winked at me and I stuck my tongue out at him. Track's face relaxed a bit, but he still didn't look happy. Was this really happening? You boys go wait outside, Phil stated. I'll come out in a minute and we'll have ourselves a little chat. Wow, my whole body tingled then. He was very sexy when he went alpha, even if he wasn't a full alpha. Jackson gave a happy nod and left. Track lingered. Phil raised his brow and Track shrugged. Hey, somebody has to look out for her. Don't you dare say it, I snapped, and then Track did smile. Phil cleared his throat and Track left, but again made sure not to close the door. Oh my God, I gasped, flopping back on the bed. Phil chuckled then. He's a good nursemaid. We both smiled when there was a low string of cursing from the other room. So, what are you guys going to talk about? I asked, pretending to be clueless. You, Phil grinned, and your innocence. What? I gasped, and then heard the same thing from Track and Jackson in the other room. Phil's face turned deep red. I meant your honor. Innocence that way. Gads, he moaned. He cleared his throat and sat up more. I better get up before I say something else stupid. I sat up next to him and kissed his cheek. He turned and went to kiss me when we heard the front door open and then close. I thought I told you to leave them alone, came Ryan's hard voice. I moaned as Track started to defend himself and Jackson jumped in. Phil smiled and gave me a soft kiss, then climbed out of bed. You're lucky enough not to have to face the lack of plumbing around here. I threw my legs over the bed. So I've heard. He helped me up, then pulled me to him. Quick shower, and then I'll be back. What about that talk? Best time to talk to heated wolves? Under freezing cold hoses outside. He walked over to the other bed, grabbed his duffel bag, smiled at me, and then walked out of the room. I sat on the edge of the bed, smiling as he went. Told you get used to being cold, I said, sticking my tongue out at the neatly made and very empty bed across from me. There was a soft knock, on the door, and then Beth's head poked in. She smiled, and when I nodded, pushed the door open with her shoulder. I brought some nice warm water for you to freshen up with. I looked at the deep bowl in her hand and saw a few towels tucked under her arm. She sat them on the other nightstand and then looked back towards the door. Shelley and Mary have been wondering if... I stepped up to the bowl. I would love to meet them. Beth grinned. Well now, you get cleaned up and then visitors. May walked in then, a small box in one hand and a smaller bowl in the other. Glad to see you up and about, she chimed, placing the bowl next to the other one. May was obviously the more serious of the two, but even her smile was genuine and easy. I'm sorry that you had to leave your home because of me, I frowned, shifting my bare feet. Don't you dare, Beth beamed. Indoor plumbing? Room service? She chuckled. I'm not sure I can do without now. May smiled at her friend. She has already given Tom Tom and Will her list, and we might get indoor plumbing before long, thanks to you. I bit my lip and smiled. Well, that was something at least. Now freshen up. Take your time, Beth chirped. The others aren't going anywhere. With that, they both left and shut the door behind them. She's cleaning up, I heard May state in a hard voice. She was definitely used to being in charge. You can all just wait. When I yanked my bag out from under my bed, I moaned, seeing the bags from Track's shopping spree in town. Rock and Jackson had plenty of opportunity to nose through, and I couldn't remember how they were set, to be able to tell if they had gone through them. Finally, I grabbed some clothes, then waded through the underwear, trying to decide. Once I washed up, I brushed my hair, and then decided to put it in a ponytail. Luckily, I had one hairband in my bag, and I flinched and even yelped as I wrapped it around carefully, then ran my fingers through my bangs to settle them. I thought about the makeup, and then decided against it. I would have to save that for a special occasion. After shoving my bag back down under my bed, I shoved my feet into my boots and attempted to tie them. I finally just pulled the laces tight, tucked them in the boots, and headed for the door. Ryan, Marcus, and Will stood up, and I looked down at the table that was covered in food. My brows wrinkled, seeing the bags and wrappers. We made a store run, Marcus smiled, and I grinned. So much for roughing it. I turned and noticed the heavy blankets over the window. It's midday, Will explained, and I nodded. Guess that meant I was stuck in here for now. Beth walked out of the other room, and I frowned. You really should take your own room back, I stated. Not to worry, she beamed. Her braid again flopped over her shoulder. A bed is a bed. Then the door handle turned, and I yelped as Marcus flew across the room and slammed it shut. Ryan looked at me, and I trotted back into the bedroom and shut the door. When I got the all clear, I stepped out and smiled to see Rock and little Al standing there. The small owl saw wolf ran at me, and I knelt down, nearly being knocked over by his hug. I heard you jump the line fence, he stated, stepping back. Line fence? Uh-huh. Down by the territory line. It's ginormous, he gasped, and I lowered my head a little. Well, it didn't go as planned, I chuckled softly, and he laid his small hand softly on my splint. I'm sorry you got hurt, he whispered. My heart tightened, and I shrugged. It's not so bad, and I deserved it, I chuckled back. Rock plopped 2 more bags on the table, and I shook my head. Another trip to the store? Yep, Gotta cityfy these wolves a bit, Rock smiled. He pulled out a small plastic bag and tossed it to Al, who caught it. Gummy bears, the little boy exclaimed, as if he had been handed a bag of gold. Easy there, Will chuckled. You give that bag to Beth, and she'll dole 'em out to you, or you'll inhale that whole bag. Beth stepped up, took the bag, and opened it. She scooped out a small handful and dropped them into his hand. He looked down at them, sighed, and then shrugged. Oh well, at least I get some. I grinned and stood up, looking around the room, looking for Phil and Track. They're still talking, Rock stated, then looked at Ryan. We might need to get some ice packs ready. My eyes widened and Ryan smiled. Beth, we just might need your healing services shortly. She giggled and I smiled at her. I bet she was always happy. There was a soft knock on the front door, and again I was amazed at how fast Marcus was. He called out, and a female answered. But it wasn't May. Beth nodded. That would be Shelley and Mary. Will sighed. Ryan, I think that's our cue. This place is about to be run over with females. Ryan chuckled and looked at me. It's about time she had more than musk around her. I rolled my eyes, and Marcus looked at Rock, neither looking too easy about it. If you boys want to stay, you're welcome to it, Will stated, and Ryan laughed. I liked it when he laughed. Then my alpha gestured to the bedroom door, and I hurried out of the room. The front door opened. I heard several voices, and then it closed again. Beth called out to me, and I timidly walked back out into the main room. Rock and Marcus were nowhere to be seen, and I smiled. Chickens. Beth was sliding a chair under the handle of the door. That ought to keep them from busting in, she stated, and then turned. Raina, this is Shelley and Mary. Mary caught my eye first. She was beautiful. Her shiny blonde hair was softly braided behind her, with twirls of loose curls around her temples. Her blue eyes looked like sapphires, and her dark lashes were visible from where I stood. She was only an inch shorter than me, but looked like she should be in a fancy shop instead of a log cabin. Her skin was soft and perfect, and she smiled at me. Hello, Raina. It's good to finally meet you. Before I could reply, Beth took my good hand and walked me over. Mary is Alan's mate. They met on the West Coast, and he was scouting for a special tool thingy, she shrugged. Shelley here is married to Michaud, our resident carpenter. She isn't from Alsaw originally either. Michaud found her in a small town a few days from here. My brows wrinkled. Shelley was pretty as well, but in a down-to-earth sort of way. She looked like she belonged in a small town, although I couldn't say what about her said that. Her dark brown hair was thick and long, braided and pulled back from her face. Her brown eyes were soft and friendly. Then I looked down and my eyes widened. Shelley's stomach was larger than Mary's, but they were both obvious. Shelley put her hand on hers and smiled. Still got a ways to go, or so the healers say. I swallowed and nodded, still in awe. Sally was the only other wolf I had seen pregnant that I could remember. It fascinated me, and I couldn't stop staring. How amazing to be carrying life inside of you. This little one kicks up a storm, she chuckled, and Beth nodded. Definitely a boy, that one. The three women chuckled, and I frowned. How did they know that? Mary stepped up, and I blinked, finally lifting my eyes. Sorry, I whispered, embarrassed. It's just that... She smiled warmly at me. No need to explain. Let's all sit, Beth laughed. She has been trapped with all these males and could use our protection from all that musk for a bit. They all laughed again, and I took a seat on the couch. May? Busy getting the cat back in order, Mary chuckled. Seems the guys got a bit lazy while we were gone. Oh, I whispered. That would probably be my fault. I looked up again and tried to judge their ages. Both were younger than Sally, but older than me. Women, but still young. I thought there was another one. Jessie, Shelley smiled. She begged to come with us, but she's a bit of a tornado, and we thought we would wait a bit for that. Tornado is right, Beth grinned. That little pup can run any wolf ragged. It was nice to sit in a room without musk swirling around me, but I realized it wasn't something I really knew how to deal with. Allison was a newer friend, and my heart tugged a bit thinking about her. Missy was my only female wolf friend, except for Paige. I sighed, looking down at my hands, suddenly a bit homesick for my friends. Beth cleared her throat. You poor dear, you aren't used to female company. She said it as a statement, and my head dipped lower. Was I really so pathetic? I have a few female friends, I stated into my lap, then slowly described the three. Yeah, I guess I was that pathetic. And you have Sally and Natalie, Mary smiled, and I couldn't help thinking she should be on a cover of some fancy magazine. They're both furious that they couldn't come, Shelley frowned, and I nodded. Soon enough, Beth chuckled. We're packed to the rafters as it is. They are far more comfortable in that nice hotel anyhow. There went a pang of guilt. They should be at home, not stuffed into a hotel, fancy or not. Sally loves you dearly, Mary smiled at me, and Natalie is already acting like a mother wolf. Again they all chuckled, and I realized how odd it was to hear female voices around me. I smiled then, deciding I liked it. It was definitely more relaxing, and they were not sitting here trying to play the stupid games most vampires played. I think I'll make some tea, Beth announced, walking towards the kitchen. So, how come I couldn't think of anything to say? I should have more to say to females than males, but I was out of my element. Fortunately, they weren't. They laughed and talked until the tea was brought in. Now, you can shut me up, Shelley stated, picking up her cup. But have you made any plans? My brows lowered and I shook my head. Plans? She leaned forward. Yes, you and Phil. I shrugged, still not quite sure what she was getting at. Have you set a date? Huh? Then my eyes widened. Oh! A rush of heat washed over me, and I put my hand to my cheek. Did I blush? What an odd sensation. Her smile was soft, though, and she nodded. You've been through so much, and with all the guys around you. Mary huffed, and Shelley did the same. I bet none of them have given a thought about you and about all the happy things you should be thinking about. I swallowed hard. Part of me wanted out of this room, but the other part didn't want to move. They weren't pawing over me like Alyssa did. There was no malice in their voices either. They smiled and pulled me in, and I had to admit I kind of liked it. It was like having older sisters, and, well, Beth was nearly bouncing in her chair. I just sort of got all my memories back, I confessed. Beth nodded. Good thing, too. Now, this Poulsen, does it have a hall? A hall? Wedding hall. Oh, I chewed my lip. Yes. I had been to several weddings at the Polson Hall. It was large, nice, and on packed territory. They seemed to sense my unease, and Mary sat back on the couch. Ellen and I were married here, out in the meeting circle. She smiled when she said it, and I relaxed. They all talked about the ceremony. That sounded beautiful. It was in the spring. They had gathered flowers from all the fields, and had an arch woven from branches. I leaned forward, caught up in their stories. Shelley was next, and I found out that she and Michael married on the road. He couldn't wait, she chuckled. Beth huffed. Males. Then she winked. We had them do it right before they settled, though. I was laughing with them now, and crossed my legs under me as they shared their past with me. They were a close pack, as close as we were. They ribbed each other just a bit, but so much different than the guys did. They boasted about each other and blushed from the praise. I liked them. It was over an hour later when there was a knock on the door. I smiled, knowing it was Phil. He called out, and Beth chuckled. Does them good to have to wait now and then, she winked, standing up. Let 'em in, Mary grinned. I think it's time we turn the tables on these males. She smiled at me when my brows rose. Beth looked at me, and then I jumped up and hurried into the other room. I heard a chair squeak across the floor, and then the front door opened. Don't tell me you ran her off already, I heard Cal laugh. I put my hand on the handle to open it when Mary called out to me. Phil smiled at me, and Cal gave me a happy nod. I noticed a bruise on Phil's cheek, and I frowned and walked over to him. Wait till you see the other guys, Cal laughed, and my eyes tightened. Phil slid his arm around my waist and looked around the room. As glad as I am that you finally have some female company. Beth giggled like a teenager, and Mary nodded. Yes, we know. You missed her, she teased. Yes, I did, Phil stated proudly, and I looked up at him. He didn't seem uncomfortable and actually looked relaxed. I had forgotten that he was really used to being in charge. Plus, he lived in Polson, one of the largest wolf packs there was. I was the only one here that wasn't used to large amounts of people. Cal walked over and sat several handled paper bags on the table. Thought you ladies might like something to eat. Mary and Beth quickly started going through the bags, and Shelley walked over to us, smiling. You two make a very nice couple. I lowered my head, but Phil thanked her. I won't even ask what you were all talking about, he chuckled, as Cal helped them unload the food. We were talking about weddings, Beth exclaimed, as she sat out the ready-made platters. I groaned, and Phil hugged me to him. I'm sure you were, he said, and laughed when I looked at the floor. She needs more girl time, Mary put in, shooting my wolf a hard look, even though she smiled. She's stuck with all you males, all the time. She shook her head, putting some food on a paper plate. There was another knock on the door, and Beth shook her head. Just like we were saying, you all have her so stifled, poor dear. She gave me a sympathetic nod. No wonder she's so jumpy all the time. Ouch. Okay, this was quickly turning into poor, pathetic Raina conversation. Phil kissed the top of my head. I think that's our wounded packmates, he whispered, laughing. Wounded? I gasped, then looked at his cheek. What exactly had gone on out there? I let him usher me into the other room and close the door. He stayed on the other side and opened it a minute later. Wow, I gasped, looking Track and Jackson over. Rock and Marcus chuckled as they squatted near the table and helped themselves to some food. Track's black eye was a bit swollen on the brow, and there was a good bruise on his jaw. Jackson's hair was still messed up, with a few leaves poking out, and the cut on his lip was still fresh, even though that thankfully was clean. Good thing wolves heal fast. Despite their injuries, everyone was in a good mood, and Shelley and Mary seemed right at home as she slapped Rock's hand when he reached for a plate she was making. He shrugged and then went for a sandwich on another platter. It was a little awkward and cramped, but they were all enjoying themselves. Beth played the happy hostess and seemed genuinely happy to have the small party in her living room. I moaned when there was another knock, and so did Rock. He looked up. Phil? Ryan wanted to talk to you, he said, shrugging. Phil gave a small growl, but Rock turned back to his food and the company around the table. I looked up, and Phil sighed. I'll hurry back, he stated, kissing my cheek. I gave a sad nod, and he frowned. Once it's dark enough, we can take a walk, just the two of us. Fat chance of that, Jackson stated, and Rock nodded. This time, I growled, and Rock winked at me as he crammed a large piece of food in his mouth. Shelley leaned over and smacked the back of his head, causing him to choke. That did make me laugh. Phil walked me to the bedroom door, and I glared at it. I hated this routine. Not much longer, he smiled, and I tilted my head. What did that mean? He lifted my chin and gave me a soft kiss, smiling after. I smiled back. How could I not? I'll hurry back. I nodded and frowned at the back of the door when he left. Instead of waiting, I walked over and flopped backwards on the bed, staring up at the wooden beams. I found myself wondering what it was like not to have to hide from the sun. A low growl gurgled in my throat, and I felt my eyes watered. I had never envied those that could walk about freely. Why was I starting to now? When the bedroom door opened, I glanced towards it, and then looked back up at the ceiling. Track walked over and flopped down next to me. Counting knots in the wood? He asked quietly. I shrugged, and he chuckled. Extremely boring, if you ask me. I didn't. He rolled onto his side. I know this sucks. Yep, was all I could say. My nose was tingling now, and I was slightly confused as to why. I knew I had plenty of reasons to be sad, but why would I suddenly care about something I had never been able to do? You want to watch a movie? Jackson stated, and I looked over. I hadn't even heard him come in. When I didn't respond, he laid on my other side, crossing his arms over his chest. Nah, why watch a movie? This is so much more exciting. Again, I didn't respond. The three of us laid there, Track now on his back again, staring up at the handmade rafters with us. Hey, I think there's a rabbit in that one, Jackson stated, pointing up at one of the beams. It's a cow, Track shot back, and I closed my eyes, trying to keep the tears underneath. Then I gasped as the entire bed jumped, and I was bounced up in the air several inches. You are an idiot, Track snapped as I opened my eyes. Hey there, hot stuff, Rock smiled, his nose only inches from mine. I blinked and then watched him fly off to the side, Track now sitting up. There was a thud, but Rock only laughed. Hey, not my fault she's so sexy. Jackson was up on his knees now. Too bad she thinks you smell like dogwood. Track grabbed my shoulder and rolled me towards him just as the other two lunged and landed hard, right where I had been laying. I grunted, and Track shook his head. Musk. From? He gestured towards the door, and I frowned. But they're married and pregnant, I whispered, then grunted again as someone slammed into my back. Track reached over me and shoved someone hard. Yeah, I know. It's not so much that they want 'em, it's just... We're reaching our peak, Rock chuckled, then grunted. We males have a window where we... Another grunt and the bed rocked. Track moved down a bit and pulled me with him. Need to... The wood from the frame creaked and then splintered. There was a loud crash and the wind was sucked out of me as we fell. "Oh, crap," came Jackson's voice, and I bit my lower lip. When I sat up, I looked around and moaned. The mattress we were at was on ground level now, and the head and the foot poles were snapped and tilted inward. You broke the bed," I gasped, still in shock. "Jackson broke the bed," Rock snapped, quickly jumping up and off the wreck. Track gave a deep growl and sat up, then stood and held out his hand. I took it, and then put it over my mouth when I turned. It was seriously broken. Just then the door opened, and we all whipped our heads around. "What in the..." It was Ryan, and he didn't look happy as he walked in and looked over us. Phil was right behind him, and he hurried over to me, giving me a visual inspection. "I'm fine," I whispered nervously. Ryan stepped up to the bed, and the room went quiet. I shrunk up closer to Phil, who put his arm around my waist. Our alpha sighed and then turned, looking at each one of us slowly. Gads, my stomach tightened and my head lowered. I even shook a bit. "No point asking which one of you did this," he said in a tight voice. He was ticked. "We are guests here," he hissed. "You three, come with me now." I looked up to see him point to the guys. Even though I had nothing to do with the damage, I felt guilty. Track, Rock, and Jackson followed him out quietly, their heads down and their invisible tails between their legs. "They were just horsing around," I whispered afterwards. Phil nodded. "I know, but like he said, we're guests here." I frowned, nodded, and then looked up at him. "What time is it?" He looked a bit shocked by my question and then seemed to understand. "About an hour until it's okay." "Stupid son," I mumbled, walking over and putting my hand on one of the broken ends of the bed. "It has its purpose," Phil chuckled, and I shrugged. It didn't serve any purposes for me, except keeping me a prisoner when it was around. "Well, we have the cabin to ourselves for a while." I looked over at him and he reached out his hand. "Let's go sit in the other room." We sat on the couch and I watched him put some logs on the fire before he came and sat next to me. I snuggled up next to him, pulling my legs up under me. The frown slipped away and I laid my head on his shoulder. We didn't talk, we just sat there, holding each other and listening to the sounds around us. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was nice, comfortable quiet, just the two of us. That's where I'm gonna stop.